This is my ranking of RTS games that I've played based purely on my personal experience. Each one is placed from masterpiece down to trash, depending on how strong the strategic depth feels, how well base building and resource management are balanced, and how effectively each game rewards smart positioning, timing, and decision-making in real time. Let's get straight into the list. WARNO was the kind of RTS that took me a few matches to understand, but once the system started making sense, the battles became far more satisfying. I liked how large fights never felt messy, even when tanks, infantry, artillery, and helicopters were all moving at once. The line of sight system added a lot to positioning, especially during defensive battles where planning ambushes and controlling roads actually mattered. Urban combat also felt much stronger here than in many strategy games I've played because cities turned into long, dangerous fights instead of quick captures. I also spent time with the single-player operations and Army General mode, and both gave me plenty to work through without getting repetitive too quickly. The slower pace also made battles easier to read. This easily belongs in the excellent tier. Supreme Commander felt massive in a way very few RTS games ever manage. The scale of battles, the giant maps, and the amount of units moving at once made every match feel like a full military operation instead of a quick skirmish. I spent a lot of time learning how the economy worked because managing mass and energy properly was just as important as building armies. The strategic zoom system also changed how I played since jumping across the map and managing multiple fronts became smooth after a while. I liked how every attack needed planning, scouting, and proper counters instead of simply throwing units forward. Even long matches stayed engaging because there was always another defense line to build or another expansion to protect. The depth here is exactly why this sits in the masterpiece tier. Age of Mythology Retold reminded me why classic RTS games still work so well today. Mixing regular armies with mythological creatures and god powers made battles feel far more varied than standard historical strategy games. I liked experimenting with different civilizations because each one changed how I approached combat, resource management, and map control. The updated visuals also helped a lot since battles looked cleaner while still keeping the charm of the older version. I spent plenty of time testing different unit combinations, especially during larger fights where heroes, myth units, and regular soldiers all needed proper support to survive. The slower pace gave me enough time to think through attacks instead of reacting every second. Some voice acting felt awkward at times, but the gameplay consistently stayed engaging. This settles into the excellent tier. Homeworld Deserts of Kharak did a really good job bringing the Homeworld style into a ground-based RTS without losing the large-scale feeling that made the series stand out. I liked how battles constantly shifted between defensive positioning, resource gathering, and sudden counterattacks that could completely change a mission. The strategic overlay became one of my favorite parts because managing huge fights across the map felt smooth without turning chaotic. I also enjoyed building different army compositions depending on the situation, especially when mixing heavy tanks, artillery, aircraft, and railgun units together. The campaign stayed engaging because missions rarely played out the same way twice, and the soundtrack added a strong atmosphere during larger battles. Some unit behavior needed extra micromanagement at times, but the combat itself stayed satisfying throughout the experience. This finds its place in the great tier. Company of Heroes 3 still had the tactical combat that made the series fun to play, especially during battles where positioning infantry, tanks, and support units properly could completely change the outcome. I liked how maps encouraged flanking, building assaults, and constant movement instead of keeping units stuck in defensive positions all match long. Urban combat was also handled really well since narrow streets, cover systems, and destructible environments made fights feel tense during larger missions. Some campaign scenarios stayed exciting because objectives changed during battles and forced me to react quickly with limited resources. The larger campaign layer outside those fights felt shallow, and the enemy AI sometimes made strange decisions during armored encounters. Even with those issues, the core RTS gameplay stayed entertaining throughout it. This belongs in the good tier. StarCraft Remastered showed me why this series became such a huge part of RTS history. The updated visuals looked excellent while still keeping the original style intact, especially during larger battles where every unit stayed easy to read. I spent a lot of time experimenting with different factions because each one demanded a different approach to combat, economy management, and map control. The campaign also held up better than I expected since the story focused more on soldiers, politics, and survival instead of trying to become overly dramatic. Multiplayer still felt intense, although older mechanics like unit pathfinding and control limitations could become frustrating during hectic fights. Even with those rough edges, the strategy depth and faction balance still feel incredible after all these years for strategy fans. This easily reaches the masterpiece tier. Tempest Rising felt like a modern version of the classic Command and Conquer style RTS games I grew up playing. Base building, harvesting resources, and managing fast battles immediately made the gameplay easy to get into, but there were still enough mechanics to keep fights interesting. I liked how both factions had different tools and special abilities that changed how I approached attacks and defenses during missions. Some units also encouraged more micromanagement than I expected, especially during larger battles where positioning mattered a lot. The campaign missions stayed fun because objectives constantly shifted between defense sections, base assaults, and commando operations. I just wish the story and characters had more personality since the briefings felt forgettable compared to the gameplay itself. The strong combat system still placed this in the great tier. Company of Heroes 1 and 2 delivered some of the most intense tactical RTS battles I've played because positioning, cover usage, and flanking mattered during almost every fight. I liked how both games focused less on building massive armies and more on controlling important areas while adapting to changing situations on the battlefield. Tanks crashing through buildings, infantry diving into cover, and artillery tearing apart entire streets made battles feel chaotic in the best way possible. The campaigns also stayed memorable because missions regularly changed objectives instead of repeating the same structure every time. I spent a lot of time protecting veteran squads since losing experienced units during heavy firefights could completely shift momentum. Both games still stand out today because the combat stays tactical without becoming exhausting to manage. This belongs in the masterpiece tier. Sins of a Solar Empire 2 felt much larger in scale than most RTS games I usually play because every match involved managing fleets, planets, research systems, trade, and massive space battles at the same time. I liked how each faction completely changed the way I approached expansion, economy management, and combat across the galaxy. Watching huge fleets clash while capital ships launched abilities across entire battlefields made late-game fights especially satisfying. There was also a lot of strategy involved in deciding when to expand aggressively or focus on strengthening defenses before pushing forward. The learning curve was definitely rough at first, since the interface and tutorials explained systems poorly, but things became far more enjoyable once I understood how everything connected together. The scale, faction variety, and space battles easily place this in the excellent tier. Beyond All Reason became much more exciting once battles started getting larger, because the amount of units, explosions, artillery fire, and destruction happening at once was far beyond most RTS games I've played. I liked how terrain actually mattered during fights, since mountains blocked radar, elevation affected movement, and positioning artillery properly could completely change an engagement. The scale of matches also made team coordination much more important, especially during huge battles where multiple players attacked different sections of the map at once. I spent a lot of time experimenting with commanders, resource management, and giant armies filled with tanks, aircraft, and defensive structures. The strategic zoom system also helped a lot, because controlling large battlefields stayed manageable despite the chaos. The huge scale and non-stop action easily placed this in the excellent tier. Command & Conquer Remastered Collection brought back the classic RTS formula in a way that still stayed fun despite showing its age in certain areas. I liked switching between the updated visuals and the original graphics because it really showed how much work went into the remaster without losing the style of the older games. The campaigns also stayed surprisingly engaging since missions regularly introduced different objectives, tougher defenses, and creative situations that forced me to think carefully about resources and unit placement. Red Alert especially added more variety with naval combat, air support, and larger-scale battles that became more satisfying as the campaign progressed. Some older mechanics like pathfinding and slow unit responses could still become frustrating during difficult missions. The amount of content and classic RTS gameplay easily secure this in the excellent tier. Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition still delivers the kind of RTS gameplay that's easy to spend hours playing without getting tired of it. I liked how the remaster improved smaller mechanics like unit control, farm management, and build queues while still keeping the original gameplay intact. Managing cities, gathering resources, and building armies across huge battles stayed satisfying because every civilization encouraged different strategies and army compositions. The campaigns also offered plenty of variety since missions constantly introduced new objectives, maps, and historical scenarios that changed how I approached each battle. Siege warfare remained one of my favorite parts because breaking through walls and defending castles required proper planning instead of rushing units forward mindlessly. The replay value and strategic depth here easily push this into the masterpiece tier. Ashes of the Singularity focused heavily on massive battles where hundreds of units, explosions, and giant armies filled the screen at the same time. I liked watching huge wars unfold across large maps, especially once battles started involving heavy units, artillery, and giant armies crashing into each other. The large scale also made controlling armies through grouped commands much easier during hectic fights. The problem was that the gameplay underneath all that spectacle stayed too simple for long periods of time. Most matches pushed me into expanding quickly without giving many interesting tactical options beyond building larger armies than the enemy. Unit variety also felt limited since many forces started blending together during larger conflicts, making battles harder to read. The huge scale was interesting at first, but this ultimately lands in the mediocre tier. Age of Empires 4 brought back the classic RTS formula in a way that still stayed engaging after long play sessions. I liked how each civilization encouraged different strategies, especially factions like the Mongols that completely changed how I approached economy management and map control. Battles also stayed tense because raids, defensive walls, and siege weapons all played an important role during larger matches. The campaigns offered plenty of variety too, with historical battles and changing objectives that kept missions from becoming repetitive. I also spent a lot of time experimenting with different maps, since terrain, forests, and choke points could heavily influence battles. Some unit pathfinding issues became frustrating during larger fights, but the tactical gameplay and faction variety still made matches consistently enjoyable. This earns its place in the excellent tier. My full ranking of RTS games based on strategic depth and real-time decision-making. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.